few months ago, I had an opportunity to have breakfast with the former editor of the Miami Herald, David Lawrence, and he asked me, "What books are you reading?" So I told him whatever I was reading at the time, which is usually the same thing that I'm always reading at the time. It was like a commentary on the Talmud, something about Jewish history, and a Daniel Silva novel. And he said, "You might want to broaden your horizons at some point and maybe read something else." It's true, I've been reading the same stuff for the last 25 years. So the next time that I meet with him, I'm still trying to prepare for that question. You know, I'm thinking about like furniture making in 15th century France and, new trends in botany. I'm going to have a list ready for him. Hopefully he won't ask me anything about them because I would never read those books, but I want to be prepared for the conversation. So it's true that my thinking in my world is not always, but often within a pretty defined box. And when I first came here, and I was going through the interview process, someone asked me, "Who are your heroes?" And so naturally, my heroes tend to be people who have done great things for the Jewish people and people who've brought us insight into the world of Torah. And one of the heroes that immediately had come to mind at that time for me was a woman who you've probably heard of named Chana Senesh. Chana Senesh was a woman who was born in Hungary and made Aliyah from there in 1939. She suffered tremendous anti-Semitism. It was very tough for her in her school. And eventually she said it's enough and moved to Israel pre-1948, which was known at the time as Jewish community there as the Yishuv in Palestine until it was changed to Israel in 1948. She joined the Jewish Brigade, which were those brave Jews who volunteered to fight with the British against the Nazis. She became a paratrooper, went back to Europe with a mission to save Jews who were being transported to Auschwitz. It was after her death that many of her poems were found, including her very famous Eli, Eli, which she wrote after a walk on the shores of the Mediterranean in Caesarea. And when those writings and poems were published, she became a hero throughout the Jewish community of Palestine. After that, her remains were brought back from where they had been buried in Hungary to Israel, and she was given a hero's funeral with hundreds of thousands of people who viewed the procession. Today, when I think of Chana Senesh, when most people think of Chana Senesh, we think of her as a Zionist, a poet, a hero, a soldier. Jews often make a special trip to visit her grave on Mount Herzl in Jerusalem in the special paratrooper section. We read her poems and we take pride in her heroism. We don't necessarily think of the months of torture she sustained at the hand of Hungarian soldiers who caught her almost immediately at the border. We don't think, like her old friends who knew her on her kibbutz near Haifa, about the tragedy of her loss, someone with such spirit and potential. We don't think of how she was tortured for months, but still refused to give up the transistor codes of her comrades when her radio was found. We don't think of how she was savagely beaten for months before being executed by a firing squad. And we might not remember that at the time of her death, she was only 23. We think of her as a hero, but not necessarily what she sacrificed to become our hero. And as I thought this week about our Torah portion, Vayishlach, Hannah Senesh kept coming to my mind as I thought about the story of Rachel. We think of Rachel, our matriarch, as the beautiful one, the favorite of her husband Jacob, the mother of the hero Joseph, who ultimately gains power over all his brothers after they betray him. But actually Rachel, just like Hannah Senesh, fulfilled her greatest act in death as well. We learn in the Torah that she died in childbirth with her second son Benjamin. And we don't necessarily think of our ancient matriarchs and patriarchs as young women. But Rachel was only 36 when she died. She wasn't buried in the cave of Machpelah with the other matriarchs and patriarchs. The Midrash gives us a reason why. She was buried on the side of the road near Bethlehem so that when the Jewish people would be kicked out of Israel, she would be there to cry for them as they left and also to welcome them back when they returned. Rachel became known because she was the only matriarch or patriarch buried outside of the cave in Hebron as the mother of the exiles, who watches over the Jewish people in the diaspora and is always prepared to welcome them back. But there's something very interesting about this idea. Who was her main son? Joseph. Joseph, who lived in the northern part of Israel. Now, her other son, Benjamin, was so very small. They were a tiny, tiny tribe that basically got swallowed up into the tribe of Judah. And why is that interesting? Why is it interesting that Rachel is the mother who welcomes back her children when they return from the diaspora? It's interesting because Joseph's sons, the only lineage that came from Rachel, were part of the 10 lost tribes. Rachel's kids never came back. And yet she's the mother of all of the mothers, who's the one who sits and cries as they leave, but also waits there for them to return. And she's the only mother for whom none of her children ever return. It's bizarre that she's considered the one who welcomes them back, but it's profound. It's even hinted at in the book of Isaiah, as well as spelled out in the Midrash, that that's who Rachel is. And so the rabbis question, what was Rachel's real sacrifice? What did she sacrifice that she should be considered the mother of the exiles instead of Leah, who was the mother of Judah, who led the return back to Israel and the rebuilding of the second temple? Ultimately, once Judah comes back, Leah's son, we have to consider what is Rachel's relationship to Judah. Well, had Rachel wanted to be the first mother, had she wanted to marry Jacob, she could have. She was in on the ruse with her father to try and trick Jacob into marrying first Leah. But Rachel didn't want to embarrass her older sister, and so she stood aside. And her sacrifice in allowing her sister to be the mother of Simon and Reuben and Levi and Judah, the first 4 sons, allowed Leah's children to be the bulk and the remainder of who the Jewish people would be. She stepped out of the way and permitted her older sister and eventually Judah to be born not from her, but from Leah. In Rachel's sacrifice for her people, her constant concern for her people suffering in the diaspora, I continue to hear these echoes of the story of Chana Senesh. Rachel was our ancient hero who taught us that we are remembered not how we prop ourselves up by what we do for others. Rachel should be remembered not for being the mother of the Jewish people, but for allowing Aleah to move in ahead of her. Chana Senesh is our modern-day hero, who also put her people before herself, humanity before personal satisfaction. And ironically, it's because of their sacrifices that we remember them for their accomplishments. Chana Senesh once said, "There are stars whose radiance is visible on earth, though they have long been extinct. There are people whose brilliance continues to light the world, even though they are no longer among the living. These lights are particularly bright when the night is dark. They light the way for humankind." That's how we remember Rachel. She's the one who yearns for us in the diaspora when night is most dark. And that's why people like Chana Senesh are my heroes, the people that I look up to. Imagine how much brighter our world would be if we each sacrificed something of our own fortune for the greater good of others. Amen.